Welcome to the final live stream for Climate Assembly UK's offline and online weekends. In addition to our plans, this afternoon the Assembly is going to consider the implications of coronavirus and the resulting lockdown for the question that the Assembly is addressing. So that's the question of how the UK should reach its target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The Assembly is only going to hear from one speaker on this topic, who's going to pose a number of questions for the Assembly to consider. That speaker is Chris Stark, the Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change. Chris is also one of our expert leads, and all four of our expert leads have agreed what Chris is going to say. Here is his presentation.
Hi everyone, it's really good to see you again virtually. Now, since the Assembly last met face-to-face in Birmingham, we have all been affected by the coronavirus pandemic. Now, it's obviously a health crisis, but it will also change the context for the question that the Assembly has been considering, how should the UK meet its net zero greenhouse gas emissions target? We are all going to have different views on the implications of the coronavirus and the measures that the government has introduced to control its spread. You might, for example, be thinking about how risks like these are managed in the future. You might also be thinking differently about the role the government is playing in this crisis. I've certainly been having some of those thoughts. I'm sure you have too. Very important thing to say before we kick off on this is that there are no direct links between coronavirus and climate change, but the extent of change that we've seen to our way of life in the last couple of months means that there are links to what you've been discussing. So what we wanted to do is to give you the chance to discuss all of that and to let Parliament know what you're thinking as part of this process. So on to slide 2. And I'm going to start our discussions on this issue by running through the 3 aspects of the situation you see here, and crucially how that might affect the way that the UK reaches net zero emissions. Firstly, what has actually happened during the lockdown? So what's the government done? What impact has that had on us? What impact has there been on emissions and the climate? Secondly, how might lifestyles be changed in the future by all of this? I'll offer some reflections on how that could happen, what lifestyle changes there might be, and how that might affect the net zero target in the future. Thirdly, rebuilding after the pandemic. How might the government approach the task of rebuilding the economy and society as the restrictions are eased? How might those steps help or hinder the net zero goal? Let me look at each of these in turn. So on to slide 3. So firstly, what has actually happened during the lockdown? We've obviously seen a very urgent need to slow down infections of coronavirus, and that's what's led to the very tough measures introduced by the government a few weeks ago. The lockdown, as it's become known, is designed crucially to reduce the contact we have with others, but it's also having some major impacts and causing some major changes to the way the economy works and to our society. All of us have had to change how we work, how we travel, how we live in our homes, what we buy, even what we eat. So the first observation really is that the government has stepped in quite an extraordinary way to our way of life. So we've seen some remarkable changes. They've acted very swiftly to introduce new measures. There are very tough new laws to stop us coming into contact with one another so often. And the government in general is doing remarkable things, including keeping the money flowing in the economy with new payments to people so they can keep earning when they might otherwise have lost their jobs, and new financial support for self-employed and small business owners. What we've seen in the last few weeks might have changed your view about what the government can or should do. Second observation is that people in the UK are having to suffer a lot of new hardship, that either from coronavirus itself or from the lockdown measures. Many of us, sadly, have lost loved ones during this crisis, and many more of us are feeling the strain of not seeing family members or friends. Some people have also lost their job or had their livelihoods substantially curtailed. And although many people do support the lockdown measures, there are some who strongly resent the restrictions that have been placed on their lives. Some new worries have also emerged during this crisis, particularly about our food supplies and our food system. Many of you will have experienced problems in the supply of food to shops recently, shortages of some products. All of that has highlighted, to some at least, our dependence on imported food and other products. And the third observation is that the lockdown has also had a pretty dramatic impact on many of the things that cause greenhouse gases. Now, we can't say yet what the full impact of the lockdown will be, but I'll highlight some of the most important impacts for you today. We are travelling much less than we used to, so we aren't using fossil fuels for transport as much. Air travel has been dramatically reduced. There are much fewer road journeys by car at the moment. Overall, use of motor vehicles during the lockdown has more than halved, and that's led to, amongst other things, much cleaner air in our cities and towns, and a big reduction in transport emissions overall. The country's demand for electricity has also fallen during the lockdown, particularly because many businesses aren't open and aren't consuming that electricity. And that means that less electricity overall now needs to be generated, and that wind and solar and nuclear power are now making up a greater proportion of all the electricity that's being used. And that's because the national grid always tries to use those forms of generation first before other forms of generation. So emissions from electricity generation are down overall. And we've even seen the longest ever run of days without burning coal to make electricity in the UK. And lastly, we are all at home more, as I am today. So more energy is being consumed in the home, be that for cooking, for heating, or for the electricity appliances that we have in our homes. That means that emissions related to the home have risen a little, at least during the lockdown, possibly by a fifth. Overall, when we look at those impacts, we've seen a dramatic fall in UK emissions during the lockdown. We think emissions might have fallen by around a third over that period, and possibly even more than that. What might be surprising is how small the impact will be on climate change itself. The steps we've seen here in the UK have been replicated in other countries around the world to varying degrees. So global emissions will fall this year, possibly by as much as a tenth, but emissions are still continuing, just at a slower rate. So carbon dioxide is still being added to the atmosphere this year. Now, one way to think about that is filling a bath from a tap. If the tap represents global carbon dioxide emissions and the level of water in the bath is the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, what we've done is slightly turn down the tap during the global lockdown, but water is still flowing from the tap and the level of the bath is still rising. So to really slow climate change, the tap still needs to be turned right down and permanently. And that needs to be a permanent change with things like moving from petrol vehicles to electric vehicles, rather than the kind of short, sharp restrictions that we've seen during the lockdown, if we want to impact on climate change in the long run. So a question to get you thinking in all of that is, does the experience of the coronavirus and the lockdown make you feel any differently about how the UK should get to net zero? On to slide 4. The big question is how lifestyles might be changed by all of this in the future. The changes that we've seen to our lives recently are enforced and they are intended to be temporary. They're probably not a useful way to think about how we will address climate change in a permanent sense. But as the lockdown continues, an obvious question is whether any of this is going to have a lasting impact. And if so, how might that affect the challenge of reaching net zero in the UK? Now, very important to say at this stage, we are not in a position to predict confidently how things will change after this. But I thought it would be useful to offer 4 perspectives on this, four things to think about, areas where we could see lasting changes in lifestyles and how that might affect the net zero goal. Firstly, remote working and video conferencing. Many office workers particularly have had the new experience of working from home consistently during the lockdown, using video conferencing software like this, like Zoom, which we're using today. Doctors have also moved to offering consultations remotely. These kind of experiences might make video calling, video conferencing a more accepted practice in the future. So one question is whether this might lead to us commuting and travelling less in the future, and whether that might then reduce greenhouse gas emissions from surface transport. Secondly, on air travel, we have seen a dramatic fall off in air travel, which has led to some of the financial difficulties that you're hearing reported from amongst the airlines and the airports. Currently, there are travel bans around the world. There are rules to quarantine travellers when they arrive. All of that's making international air travel particularly unappealing. But in the future, we may have enduring worries about these kind of pandemics that might mean governments are going to require stricter measures to guarantee the health of travellers by plane. And that could curb our air travel and reduce emissions from aviation. Thirdly, on industries and employment, and sadly, one of the lasting impacts of the coronavirus shutdown is likely to be the premature closure of industries, and with it, the jobs that are in those industries in the UK. One of the UK industries that is probably most at risk at the moment is our oil and gas sector. There is now a really low price for oil because there's too much global supply and very little global demand. That's going to make petrol and diesel cheap in the short run, but it's also going to make it much less appealing for those oil companies in Britain, in the UK, to drill for oil in the North Sea, for example. There might also be public pressure to make more things that we consume here in the UK coming out of this, especially so that we're not so exposed to the risks of interruption to imported goods in the future. That could mean higher emissions here in the UK if we produce those things using fossil fuels here in the UK. And on road transport and the difficulty of social distancing, what that will do to public transport. If we face lengthy periods of social distancing coming out of the coronavirus crisis, fewer people are going to be able to use public transport. And many are going to need to look, therefore, at alternatives for travel. If that alternative is a car, we're going to see new problems of congestion on roads and higher emissions with it. So one alternative to all of that is to make it easier to walk or to cycle, or even to scoot. During the lockdown, we've actually seen an increase in the number of people who've been using bikes, for example. One idea is to repurpose more of the roads network that we have across the UK to support that kind of travel. Almost half of the journeys taken in towns and cities are for journeys around 2 miles or under 2 miles. That could be a good candidate for the kind of journey that you could walk and cycle for instead of using the car. So to sum up in all of this, there are probably two broad questions which you see on this slide that you might want to consider. Firstly, do you think lifestyles will change after the lockdown, or do you think they'll go back to how they were before? Secondly, as the lockdown eases, do you agree or do you disagree that steps should be taken to encourage lifestyle changes like this to be more compatible with reaching net zero overall? On to slide 5. And the last section is about how we rebuild after this pandemic. And the coronavirus lockdown is likely to cause one of the biggest ever reductions in activity in our economy. And sometimes we call that a recession. Right now, governments around the world and here in the UK are thinking about how they can rebuild their economies. And the decisions that governments will take and that businesses will take over the coming period are going to have a lasting impact on emissions and a lasting impact, therefore, on our progress towards net zero in the UK. So some things to consider on this. Firstly, investing public money. Following a recession, governments quite often look to invest public money to provide new jobs, to get the economy started again. That could be investment in infrastructure like transport projects or broadband projects, or it could be in the energy networks in the streets around us. The government could design that kind of investment plan to help achieve net zero overall. For example, they could provide investment for renewable energy or for public transport. So that's something it's really, really useful to think about as we come out of this. Secondly, using regulations and incentives to encourage investment. It's not just the government who can spend to get the economy going, it's also businesses and it's also private investors. Government can use regulations to influence what things that money is spent on, and even when that money is spent. So driving investment towards the things that help to reduce emissions and away from the things that cause them. So just a couple of examples of what I mean by that. Firstly, the government could, for example, relax planning regulations so that we see new renewable energy projects constructed more quickly. That would obviously come at the cost of the penalty of rushing through consultation with local communities. Secondly, government could introduce new incentives or regulations to phase out fossil fuel technologies more rapidly and encourage people and businesses to spend money on replacing them with low carbon alternatives. So one idea is a scrappage scheme, which is a financial incentive to get rid of an old technology like a gas boiler or an old car and replace it with a newer one like a heat pump or an electric car. That can get the economy going by requiring more of those new technologies to be manufactured or installed and supplied here in the UK. Avoiding lock-in of our use of fossil fuels is a really interesting topic as we come out of this. In previous recessions, we've seen how governments have turned to steps that have made some fossil fuels cheaper as a way to ease the economic impact of the recession. But they might do that by reducing taxes on fuels, for example. We've also seen how governments have invested in projects that can encourage our use of fossil fuels in the future, like road building. So a key question for net zero is whether we can avoid encouraging those things that lock in high emissions and instead stimulate those things that lock in lower emissions. As I've already said, that's things like renewable energy projects. But one really important example here might be measures to improve the energy efficiency of homes. So things like better insulation in homes or double glazing. Some of you have heard about these things in earlier weekends. The fourth issue is industry bailouts. Many industries have been badly affected by the pandemic and the lockdown, and they're asking right now for government support. Sometimes we call that government bailouts. That's included industries that we've been discussing in the Assembly that have high emissions, like airlines. Now, there's a great deal of debate about whether it's right for a government to prop up a company that's failing in the current crisis. But if governments choose to do that, one approach they can take is to attach conditions to any bailout or any support that they offer. And we've seen that in France, for example, where the government there have indicated their support for Air France will be dependent on it meeting new climate targets. And the last issue on this slide is about reduced incomes and the pressure that citizens and consumers are going to feel coming out of this. As we emerge from the peak of the pandemic, the full scale of the recession is going to become clear. Many people are going to see that their incomes have been reduced. One of the debates that we will be having, I'm sure, is what should happen to taxes in those circumstances. Should they go up to provide money for more public services, or is this the time to actually cut taxes so that we get more money put into the economy directly and people keep more of their income? What's definitely clear is that some people are going to find it harder to invest themselves. That might well have an impact on some of the things that we've been discussing as an Assembly, for example, electric cars or making home improvements on energy efficiency. There could be steps by the government to make some of those things cheaper, although the question will be obviously whether the public finances are going to be strong enough for the government to be able to offer financial incentives like that. What's clear overall is that there are some very tough choices ahead for the government. So it's really useful to hear your thoughts on that. So a question to get you started off on that is whether you agree or disagree that steps taken by the government to help the economy recover should be designed to help achieve net zero. So it's over to you now.
So that is the end of the live stream for this weekend and for the Assembly weekends as a whole. All the presentations from all our speakers, all the videos of them speaking, their slides and transcripts of what they said are available on the Assembly's website, climateassembly.uk. If you've enjoyed the live stream, please do check them out. The Assembly will now enter its report writing phase, and we hope to release the report in the summer. To keep an eye on information about when that's happening and any further news, please follow our social media channels. We're at Net Zero on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Thank you very much.